You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. I mentioned, of course, the World Health Organization deciding to capitulate to China by skipping over the letter Xi in the Greek alphabet when naming variants. Well, we also had this funny story where The Simpsons had an episode in which the Simpson family went to Beijing and they visited Tiananmen Square and saw, as you can see on the screen there, a sign that said nothing at all happened on that site in 1989. And this episode conspicuously was absent from the offerings on Disney Plus in Hong Kong. So The Simpsons was announced, and if you were skipping through all the episodes from whatever season it was in 2005, you'd say, oh wow, I wonder what happens next. Oh, I think it's that one where they go to China, and then the episode wouldn't be there. And Disney Plus has decided that appeasing China is more important than actually offering the full slate of episodes from The Simpsons. So I noted on Twitter that, what do the letters Xi and The Simpsons have in common? Both have been censored to appease Chairman Xi and the Chinese Politburo. Now, I should say, I'm not one of these totally buy Canadian people. I think buying Canadian is great, but what I mean by that is that I'm sympathetic that not everyone can afford to buy Canadian-made things. And I also realize that there are a lot of products that simply aren't made in Canada because we are, in general, an import economy on a lot of the trinkets and gadgets that people like to buy, that consumers like to buy. But there's a difference between not buying Canadian-made things and buying Chinese-made things. There are, depending on who you ask, 194 other countries you could choose from. So this is why I found it interesting to spotlight this bill that was put forward in the Senate by Senator Leo Housakos, Bill C-204. Now, this is not looking at just Chinese-made products. It's identifying a problem that's very specific, which is products in China made by forced labor, specifically in the Xinjiang region where the genocide against the Uyghur Muslims has taken place. And what Senator Housakos has proposed is a bill that would ban the import of anything made in this region. Anything, regardless of whether it was made by slave labor or not. If it was from Xinjiang, you cannot import it to Canada. Now, it's important to note we do have a prohibition on products made by forced labor, but that is not something that it seems like we've had tremendous success enforcing. At least that's what all the reports about CBSA's track record of this. This has been a huge issue, and I want to talk about it with the senator who introduced this bill to bar all imports from China's Xinjiang region, Conservative Senator Leo Housakos, who joins me now. Senator, good to talk to you again. Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, we already have, as I understand it, a specific prohibition on goods made with forced labor, which is obviously one of the big challenges in that region, in particular in China. Why is this measure needed on top of that, in your view?
Well, we do currently, as you rightfully point out, we do have in the law books a law to deal with this kind of issue with slave labor. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked. We've seen over more than a year now that the bill has been in the books that CBSA and Customs Canada has had a very hard time making determinations of what products are coming in that have been manufactured using slave labor. And I think it's time that Canada stops with the tokenisms, and I think it's time that the Trudeau government gets its head out of the sand and we take steps and measures against China for a variety of reasons. China, as we know right now, is the most egregious violator of human rights around the world. We know for a fact that they have absolutely no respect for human rights, democracy, freedom. They're trampling on that freedom in Hong Kong. They have no respect for international rule of law. We saw that, how willingly they are to engage in hostage diplomacy. And ultimately, I want to reiterate for the viewers that at the end of the day, the House of Commons passed a motion calling what's happening to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang as a genocide. The Senate of Canada passed a motion calling on the Trudeau government to implement Magnitsky sanctions against officials in the Beijing regime. And Trudeau continues to refuse and drag his feet. So I think S4, which is the number of my bill in the Senate, is a bill that amends the Tariff Act. It makes it all-encompassing. Any product that's manufactured or comes into Canada through Xinjiang is going to be not acceptable, will be turned around, and it'll be an unequivocal message that genocide and slave labor will not be tolerated by the Canadian people and the Canadian government.
One of the challenges here, and I'm sympathetic to companies that want to do the right thing but can't be entirely aware of every stage of their supply chain when you get to subcontractors and sub-subcontractors and all of that. So it strikes me that your approach would make it a lot easier for it to be enforced both by CBSA, but also for companies that are doing business with this part of the world.
100%. Every single corporation right now that's doing business in Xinjiang, they know full well what's going on to the Uyghur minority in that region. There's a genocide going on. The Beijing regime is completely intolerant of all religious groups in China. And every group and any corporation that does business there, we know full well they're doing business because they're putting profits ahead of human rights. And I've said this before and I'll say it again. There is nothing more fundamental to Canadians than democracy, freedom, and defense of human rights. That's who we are. That's our identity. Every single Canadian that's been drawn to this country, immigrants and children of immigrants, and we are all here either through immigration or are children of immigrants. We've come here because of our values, because of freedom, because of our democracy, because of human rights. And if Canadians right now aren't willing to defend them in exchange for a few cheaper products, or because some corporations want to bypass Canadian labor standards, Canadian environmental standards, intellectual property standards, in order to make profits, we should make it clear that the day of reckoning for China is now and that we will not tolerate it. And if China wants to continue to benefit from our wealthy middle class market, they have to align themselves to our rules, our regulations, and our values.
Conservatives have always been the party of free trade, and I know that free trade in its truest sense requires free actors on both sides of the transaction, but there are products being made in China that are not the products of slave labor. So why should those products be closed off to the Canadian market if that's where a company is getting its supplies from?
Well, my bill is particularly zeroing in on Xinjiang because we know there's a genocide going on over there. But I've always said in the past, we need to reevaluate all our trade relationship with China because at the end of the day, we see how they trample on democracy in Hong Kong. We see how they're belligerent towards our friend and ally in India, how they're trampling upon freedom in Taiwan. It's a regime right now that has absolutely shown time and time again, their only value is pursuit of profit and complete disregard to the values of freedom and human rights. So I think, again, the democratic world and democracy, funny enough, Andrew, has never been in a more precarious position than it is in 2021. And in a lot of G7 and G20 countries, we take for granted the fact that we have certain freedoms that come along with our capitalist system. But capitalism only genuinely works when it's accompanied by free enterprise. And you're absolutely right. Conservatives were free traders, and I'm a free trader. But free trade has to be done with a partner where you have common values, you're aligned in terms of your judicial system, your trading laws, your human rights approach to human rights, labor laws, like I said earlier, environmental laws, intellectual property protection. These are all things that the Chinese communist regime disregards.
I know in the United States there is an approach where you have a reverse onus in that if you can prove that the products you're importing are not the products of slave labor, now setting aside the challenges and proving a negative, then you'd be able to skirt past a prohibition. Why not carve an exemption like that into your bill?
Because at the end of the day, it's just another loophole that clever organizations and corporations in China find a way to get around. We know what's going on in Xinjiang. Our parliament has called it out. Parliaments around the world have called that genocide what it is. And there's certain governments that are always trying to be cute by half by allowing certain loopholes in order to appease certain corporations and certain pursuits of profit. Like I said, it's for Canadians that shouldn't be acceptable. It shouldn't be good enough.
How do we get Canadians, and I think this is Canadian business and also Canadian consumers, off of this reliance that we seem to have on cheap Chinese-made products? And I mean, it's a challenge because a lot of Canadians who are themselves dealing with economic hardship will gravitate towards products that are less expensive. The result is that we have this self-fulfilling prophecy of a reliance on these cheap goods in China, which, as you've noted, do not have a reliable supply chain to them.
Well, there's a few things we can do. Number one, there's other developing economic markets in the world that would love to have some of the lower paying jobs that are currently the benefit of the Chinese regime and the Chinese economy. And I also believe fundamentally that our G7 countries and G20 countries and our democracies around the world have to find ways to become more competitive, to cut through bureaucratic red tape, to lower taxes, to start creating manufacturing and creating jobs back in our countries, which is something we haven't done over the last 20 years. And of course, when we go back to doing that, we'll inject action into our economy. When we bring immigrants to our countries, we'll give them jobs. There's many ways to do it, but right now we've become very complacent. We've become very reliant on cheap products that come in from China. It's one thing about a product being competitive within a free market economy. It's a whole other thing when you're using slave labor. And I don't think in the 21st century, allowing any economic system, any totalitarian regime around the world to use slavery in 2021, it's unbelievable that it's happening in this day and age. And like I said, Canadians and all of us from the West have to take our heads out of the sand and take a stand with our wallets when we go to the stores and you're buying your Nike product or your H&M product, or you're buying any clothing, apparel. Ask the questions. Where is it from? Who's made this? It takes only a few seconds to get to the bottom of this, but you're taking a stand for humanity when you do that.
Well, and I should note here, the Canadian government is not necessarily immune from this problem. As I'm sure you and those watching are aware, Canadian government chose Lululemon as being the official clothing supplier for Team Canada for the upcoming Beijing Olympics. And just last week, the Globe and Mail reported that Lululemon is on a watch list for a brand that could be using products, specifically cotton, that was coming from forced labor. So you're right how insidious this is in all of these different areas of enterprise, and right back to Canada.
Look, we have over the last few decades as a government and as a people, because of our reliance on cheap goods, we've accepted and tolerated and turned a blind eye to behavior that is just the most egregious and inexcusable. And we have to start asking ourselves, the 3 or 4% of our trading activity with China, is it worth really compromising our values and who we are as a people? Canadians, hundreds of thousands gave up their lives in a successive number of wars fighting for democracy and freedom. People that came to this country in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and to this date, they're fleeing oppression and hardships around the world and authoritarian regimes, and they're coming to Canada and they embrace our passport and flag and our way of life. But yet on the back end, we're dealing with, like I said, the most brutal regime who has no value for human life, no respect for the standards that we hold so dear. And yet we continue to pursue that relationship. And it's at the end of the day, we got to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, are we going to continue to engage in this hypocrisy?
I know you've got to get your bill through the Senate first, and the House of Commons will have the chance to weigh in as well. But any early indications how other parties are going to respond to this? I would assume that this is something that should cross party lines, although we know from that motion on condemning the genocide against Uyghurs that the Liberal cabinet was very much not interested in making that condemnation.
There's no doubt the Trudeau government, as I said earlier on, they keep dragging their feet. They keep being in contempt of Parliament. At the end of the day, the House of Commons, as I mentioned, has called upon the government to recognize the genocide. They refuse. We've asked for Magnitsky sanctions. They refuse. So they seem to constantly kowtow to this Chinese regime. They seem to condemn publicly in terms of using words, certain behavior that's inexcusable, but when it comes to backing it up with action, it never seems to equate the language. It's business as usual, it's trade delegations as usual. We've seen instances where senior Liberals, including a former prime minister and senior Liberal cabinet ministers, come out and actually encourage this government during the 2 Michaels crisis to engage in hostage diplomacy, something never seen before. And that's another concern of mine. We've seen how the Chinese regime, using various organizations and corporations and agents, they have infiltrated various institutions in all aspects of our governance, our academic institutions, the business milieu, and you see it on a daily basis. So Canadians, not only have they become addicted to cheap products from China, but we've also have seen various industries, including many in the media, that have been addicted to money that the Chinese regime has been pouring into this country through foundations and academic chairs and playing out advertising. When Huawei sponsors Hockey Night in Canada, this is another form of influence on our media platforms and communication platforms in this country. And we have to remember, all these dollars coming in from all these type of fronts for the communist authoritarian regime are money that they've made off the back of people.
Very well said, and you'll be happy to know, and perhaps not all that surprised, Huawei is not a sponsor of the Andrew Lawton Show or True North, so we're good there, but I think your point is very well taken, and in the absence of action, we have some action coming from you, Senator, in Bill S-204. Senator Leo Housakos, thank you so much for joining me. It's good to talk to you.
Anytime, Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.